2019 marks the 50th anniversary of the 1969 occupation of Alcatraz by the Indians of all tribes. Growing up in Oakland, that occupation was an enormous part of the community's history and my own sort of politicization and education as a young Native person. Every year on Indigenous Peoples Day, on the day that is Thanksgiving as well, folks gather on Alcatraz for a sunrise ceremony to acknowledge and carry forward the legacy of the 1969 occupation. And it's important to remember how important that occupation was. Before the Indians of all tribes occupied Alcatraz, the official policy of the United States towards Native peoples was one of relocation, assimilation, and termination. And in the time after Alcatraz, the policy shifted to one of self-determination and sovereignty, which remains the paradigm of Native policy in the United States and in many countries actually across the world today. And so that occupation was an enormous moment in Indigenous history, in the history of civil rights and people of color in this country, and in just the history of this country. But it often gets overlooked, forgotten. Most people actually who visit Alcatraz, it's important to note, is the most visited national park in the country. Over 1.4 million people visit Alcatraz every year. But they visit it primarily because of its history as a federal penitentiary. When most people think of Alcatraz, they remember the Birdman and Al Capone and not people like the late Richard Oakes or LaNada Warjack, who we happen to have sitting here with us and was one of the original leaders of that occupation. The reason it's important to acknowledge Alcatraz is because it's possible to draw a line, I think, from that occupation, which happened right here in the Bay Area, to so many of the Native rights struggles, Indigenous rights struggles, and the activism that is very alive and well across Indian country and elsewhere. So on this panel today, we have both representatives of the original occupation of Alcatraz, as well as some wonderful activists who I've had the privilege of knowing from when I was a kid to when I was an adult, who are carrying forward in their own ways the legacy of that occupation and the enduring struggle for our rights, our sovereignty, and our freedom as Native peoples. So immediately to my left is my dear friend LaNada Warjack, Dr. LaNada Warjack, I should say, of the Shoshone-Bannock in Fort Hall, Idaho, and who was a student leader at UC Berkeley way back in 1969, one of the original occupiers of Alcatraz, who has gone on to become an educator, a PhD. Sitting next to her, my big bro, Clayton Thomas Muller, who's Cree from Puckatawagan, Manitoba, who I had the opportunity to work with for a little while at 350.org, who is, in many ways, I would say, a mentor figure to a lot of people doing activism across Indian country, and at this point, actually beyond in many different circles. Next to him, my good friend, who I've known since I was a little guy, Ross Kadee. Ross is Pomo. He does a lot of cultural organizing. I would describe it as cultural organizing here in the Bay Area. Ross is an MC. He created this thing called Snag Magazine, which is an urban Native youth magazine. So to start, I actually wanted to turn to our elder and sort of mentor, LaNada, and ask, how, LaNada, how did you get involved in the occupation of Alcatraz? What's that sort of origin story? And, what were, looking back from 50 years now, on 50 years, what were some of the big outcomes that you've seen in your own life and for Indian country?
That's a big question. Let's see. Yeah. Uh, Unfortunately, we don't have all of our people that were there at the time. But I'm still alive, and I was still there, and I watched everything happen and got active in it. I was sent to San Francisco on the Bureau of Indian Affairs relocation program when I was 18. And then I got involved in community development in the Mission District where a lot of us lived. And the Blacks had a program where they were sending their youth to UC Berkeley, so I asked them if they could send me too. And they did. So I was the first Native American student at UC Berkeley. So when the idea of Alcatraz came up, and the city of San Francisco was going to turn it over to a millionaire for a casino, then we said, wait a minute, this looks like another broken treaty to me, because a Lakota landing party went out right after the prison was terminated, and they claimed the island in behalf of their treaty. And of course, that was federal Indian law as well, that federal surplus property would return to the Native people if they claimed it. So it was enough of an insult to us to go ahead and get organized and take the island. All we had to do, we didn't have any cell phones in those days. I don't know how we did anything, but but we got on the phone and called all of our departments throughout the state of California, and all the Native American students came, so we had our kind of like an instant organization to take over Alcatraz, which we did. And it became a 19-month occupation. And I keep track of how many months it was, because there were 19 Hopis that were imprisoned on Alcatraz during the late 1800s, and that's where they kept all the war leaders for the last Indian wars in the West. The Apache, the Shoshonean Nation were having all their wars, the Paiutes, the Bannocks. And the last Indian war in the Northwest was the Bannock Indian War in 1880. So all of our leaders were taken to Alcatraz as well. And so we have a little bit of history, from our ancestors there as well. A lot of prayers have been spoken out there, because the 19 Hopi leaders were religious leaders, very powerful medicine people that were out there for that time, and they must have really put together a lot of prayers. But when we went out and maintained the occupation, unfortunately, the leader we picked, Richard Oakes, his daughter got into an accident, and she was killed. So he and his family left the island. They were there for about 6 weeks. So we were left with the rest of the occupation. So we continued on with the proposal for Thunderbird University, and I wrote all those proposals. We organized the Bay Area Native American Council, which were all of the organizations across the Bay, and all the Native organizations, and they came and supported us and met with us every time we negotiated with the federal government. So, because they said we were young and militant, and we didn't have the support of the older adult community, and so we showed them that we did have that support of the older adult community, and told them we're not militant, we're nonviolent, but we are young. I mean, that was our only sin at the time. Anyway, we negotiated with the government throughout that time. And then Ethel Kennedy introduced me to Edward Bennett Williams, who was some big attorney from the East Coast. He owned the Washington Redskins at the time. Was it Redskins? No, Red Sox, yeah. And otherwise, we would have had something to say about that, but he was going to represent us and bring out all the issues, the injustices, the treaty violations, everything that was going on our home reservations and in the urban communities. And we just couldn't get that done in time the day before the students were to come out and support us to get Edward Bennett Williams. Then the government took the island back the day before. But we had ongoing plans that we were working on throughout that whole time. And so here it is, 50 years later. I'm still alive, I can say that. And it was, you just have to take care of your life. When you're young, you don't really think about that, but it's really true. You have to do it so that you can have the health when you get later on, when you get older, so you can. I was laughing. I was thinking, God, next year I'm going to be 75, and I'll be saying, I got to get to Alcatraz. I'll be 75 years old trying to get to Alcatraz yet.
One of the things that also happened in this sort of wake of the occupation is that there obviously are also Native people who are from right here in the Bay Area and California. And to a certain extent, sort of the many sort of ripples of Alcatraz also extended to Indian country right here. And Ross, I wanted to turn to you, and ask what you've been doing this work for a long time. Richard Oakes also married into a Pomo community, and his kids and grandkids live up in Pomo country. I wanted to ask what you've seen in terms of changes in sort of cultural strength, political strength, power, and also recognition of that strength and power in your time doing this work.
Our relatives, from up north, Sonoma County, after Alcatraz happened, and we had my grandfather he was a big proponent of, he was a Reverend Al Elgin. He was the first director of the Friendship House, Intertribal Friendship House in Oakland, and I got to talk with my grandpa. He tells stories about Alcatraz, and one day he told me, I'll organize the talks between the Indians and Alcatraz and the federal agents. And I was like, what, Grandpa? You never told me that one. So, there's a whole history there of our folks that have they sacrificed their lives for us to be here, and so, but he told me stories about them taking over the BIA. We're going to take over the BIA, occupy the BIA offices, so young people, we're looking at you, it's your turn, all right? But one of the beautiful things that happened at Alcatraz was the reclaiming of lands all over the country, and we had it was one of the first movements that got national coverage, right? So we had media coverage, mainstream media coverage, and in Native communities, there'd been other struggles and other things happening, but they never got in the mainstream news. But it was a transition period where people started to look at Natives in a different way, and they started to kind of the hippie movement and the beatniks and all that kind of. They started to think about Native peoples as like, oh, those are human beings. Those human beings like us, and they started giving them the media coverage they deserve. And Alcatraz is one of those transition moments. So a lot of people, they heard about Alcatraz and they came from all over the country, came to Alcatraz and became part of it. I wanted to close by saying, Alcatraz was a turning point for the tribes, for our tribes throughout the nation. And all these land spaces, let's go utilize them. We have all these land spaces now that we've reclaimed and we work to preserve. Let's go utilize them. Let's come together as a community and put these things together. Oh.
So one theme that I've heard in the comments so far is reclaiming, right, and land, of course. But another is age, which is another part of this conversation. But age often in terms of generations and the transfer of knowledge from elders to the folks coming up behind. And one of the people who I think takes on that role in Indian country and in our activist communities is you, Clay. I've seen you mentoring and training and doing a lot of that work to train the next generation of activists and leaders and organizers. And so I wanted to ask, what are the lessons that we need to pass on from prior generations to the new generations? How do you do that sort of intergenerational knowledge transfer between organizers and activists? And why is it that so often, whether we're talking about LaNada's generation or you and Ross, that it's often the young folks who are doing this work? What is the power in Native communities? Obviously, we often honor our elders, but there's also, I think, a power in youth here that's worth sort of thinking about.
I started off my career as an organizer in my home city in Winnipeg in Canada. It's about 6 hours north of Standing Rock, just across the US-Canada medicine line. And, my older brothers, they started the largest Native gang in the country, the Manitoba Warriors. And so I grew up in that inner city gang culture that so many of our young brown and black youth grow up in who have become urbanized. And luckily, I was able to be introduced back to our culture. And for us back home, that's Sundance. And I was taken to my first Sundance when I was 18 years old. And it really cracked my heart and my head wide open to a vision of what could be possible, something I could have never imagined in the time I had spent on the earth up to that point. And, from that point, I started to engage other young people to try and share this beauty that I had discovered in our people's connection to the sacredness of our land. And, to try and get all of our young people out of these traps that exist, these cracks in the social safety net that our young people fall into, And there's so many predatorial things that are part of our economic system that prey on our people, especially our young people. And, and so at that time in the 90s, a bunch of us young natives, we got together and we started the Native Youth Movement. And we began to do work across the country, decolonization work, work aimed at helping our young people, decolonize their minds, to unlock the mind of the colonized mind, to decolonize our young people and to bring them back, to establish that connection to the sacredness of Mother Earth. And ever since then, it's been one hell of a ride. But what I think is beautiful about our young people is, and what I remember from when I was a young person, is that people told us we were crazy when we started the Native Youth Movement, that we couldn't do something about the gangs in the inner city. When we started the tar sands campaign and took on every freaking oil company operating in the Canadian tar sands, they told us we were crazy and that we would never be able to keep the tar sands landlocked, that they were going to build all the pipelines they wanted to build. And you know what? We've been knocking those pipelines down one after the other. In our Indian way, we have this way of seeing the world. In Cree way, we talk about the seventh generation, and that when we do things, often people say, oh yeah, the seventh generation, Crees, they think 7 generations ahead. But actually, it's a little bit different than that. It's not quite that simple. When we talk about thinking in terms of 7 generations, we're thinking about the past 3 generations, okay? And the lessons that they've taught us, the sacrifice they made so that we could be here. The generation that we're in right now, the here, and 3 generations ahead. And that's how we make the decision. And it's a different way of thinking. It's a different way of worldview, of seeing, of thinking about the consequences of the actions that you take in the now, you know? And, you know, and so these young people, the part that they play in it is that they see things that my generation, you know, I'm middle-aged now, I'm 42, and some of our elder generation, we can't see certain things because it, you know, it's just different. So these children and these youth, they see things that we can't see. So we have to trust them, and we have to resource them and amplify their voices and support them. And they're gonna make mistakes, and they're gonna hurt each other and do all kinds of things, but we have to trust that, you know, that they're gonna come out of it in a good way and lift them up.
Clay, one of the things that you brought up is the visionary capacity, I think, of young people. And of course, I want to harken back to the occupation of Alcatraz. One of the driving ideas behind Alcatraz was, I think, captured really well in a quote by the late Richard Oakes, who said that Alcatraz is not an island, it's an idea. And the idea was that when you came in New York Harbor on the East Coast, you'd encounter the Statue of Liberty. But when you came in the Golden Gate on the West Coast, you'd encounter Alcatraz, a former federal prison reclaimed as a symbol of treaty rights, native sovereignty, and our liberation, our freedom, our persistence. It would be this counter monument. Another part of it that I kind of want to draw out is the emphasis, I think, and also the forms of activism that happen in indigenous communities and in Indian country, right? The Alcatraz occupation was an occupation. It was about reclaiming land, right? It was about our treaty rights. And so, you know, I think we've touched on a little bit here the climate strikes and other forms of, or I guess broader movements that go beyond Native communities, obviously. But I want to ask to all of our panelists, actually, what is distinctive in your mind about the forms of organizing and activism that happen in indigenous communities? Why are we calling this panel a panel on indigenous activism rather than just a panel on activism? Like, what is it that makes the organizing and social movements that come out of a Native context different?
We lived in the natural world called the matriarchy, where we lived under the natural laws of the universe. And our tribal government was not these IRA tribal governments we have today, but they were the natural geographical ecosystem, everything in that circle of life, the plants, the animals. We took up the symbols, the medicines. So we lived in that natural world where we followed that. In maintaining those natural laws comes our prayers, because our prayers are powerful. It comes from your heart and your soul, through your mouth and out into the air, and sound travels on light, and it impacts the plants, the animals, and the people. So the water, everything. So that's why we have to always maintain our prayers and our dances, you know, it gives that something more, because you're dancing with Mother Earth and the heartbeat of Mother Earth, the drums. So that's why it's all our responsibility to maintain those prayers and those songs and those ceremonies, because it helps balance all land and life. And without that, we don't have anything. And then we experience all these problems like we're going through now.
You know, the spirituality piece is a fundamental piece that comes with indigenous activism, because there's a spiritual dimension to all of this work that Westerners have a hard time comprehending. You know, and that's where the songs come in. That's where the prayers come in, offering tobacco or the corn pollen or, you know, whatever it is, but that connection. And I want to bring up Standing Rock. that was a global teaching moment to teach about the difference between indigenous activism and conventional Western activism. Because Standing Rock was the largest gathering of indigenous peoples since pre-colonialism. Okay, there has never been, it became literally the 5th biggest city in the state of North Dakota was the Standing Rock occupation, okay? And, you know, it was interesting watching it happen and watching the stories coming out of there. And I think the biggest, most powerful and profound story was very simple. It was a simple Native teaching with huge implications. And that teaching was Minawachoni. Water is life. And so there's a spiritual dimension that comes with Native activism that I think humanity needs if we're going to solve, the global climate crisis. And that is fundamentally a connection to the sacredness of the place where you live. And, you know, in Canada where I live, there has not been a major environmental victory against extractivism in the last 50 years without First Nations people at the helm. Because we're your big brothers and sisters, and no matter what you think, all you non-natives, that's always going to be the case, you know? And we represent, you know, the first jurisdiction of law, and it's the original instructions that my auntie's talking about. And we are bound to enforce those, you know? And we all have different ways of doing it. There's no pan-indigenous thing. We're as diverse as Chinese to Polish, you know? We have some shared cosmology in terms of connection to Mother Earth and to the universe, but very different too. As the big brothers and big sisters and everything in between of settlers here in our homelands, and you're all welcome, you always have been, you know, we have to impose a much more intersectional and kind of intergenerational and multi-dimensional in terms of time way of thinking and strategizing and rooting ourselves in history and talking to our ancestors and seeing the ones that are coming and like taking action, you know? And that includes, you know, getting arrested. So.
Everybody's like, whoa, whoa there, Native brother.
I just want to underscore the last point that my brother Clay made, which is that, you know, if Alcatraz, Standing Rock, Indigenous activism, these things mattered for our communities for the last 50 years, but for the next 50 especially, and for all time moving forward, I think they're going to matter to all people. Yeah. That's why it's important to know about them in the context of the climate crisis, in the context of some pretty apocalyptic shit, to be honest with you. We are post-apocalyptic people, but we actually have and hold knowledge for how to have a more just relationship between people and the earth, the land that we're upon. And I think that that's important to keep in mind, that Alcatraz, Standing Rock, Indigenous activism, it's going to matter not just to our people, it already matters to our people, but it needs to matter to other people too.